The fluorescent lights above the military tribunal felt like surgical lamps, cold and unforgiving. I sat ramrod straight in my dress blues, every ribbon and insignia polished to perfection. Yet I felt more exposed than I ever had in combat. The weight of a dozen pairs of eyes pressed against my chest where my scars still ached like fresh wounds, hidden beneath the crisp fabric of my uniform. My name is Captain Sarah Chen, and I've spent 12 years proving that I belong in places where few women stand. I thought I'd face the worst storms the military could throw at me. I thought I knew what betrayal felt like when bullets started flying, and backup never came. I was wrong about everything. Reckless operator. The voice that shattered the silence wasn't from the panel of judges. It came from the gallery behind me, sharp and merciless as a blade between the ribs. I felt the room freeze around me, the soft scratch of pens stopping mid-sentence, even the distant hum of the air conditioning seeming to hold its breath. Remove her from active duty immediately. I didn't need to turn around to know who was speaking. That voice had shaped my entire life, had driven me to excellence, and haunted my failures in equal measure. Colonel James Chen, my father, stood in the witness section pointing at me, as if I were an imposter wearing his daughter's uniform. The tribunal judge, a stern woman with steel-gray hair, raised an eyebrow. Colonel Chen, you're out of order. Please. She's a liability to every soldier under her command, my father continued, his voice cracking with something I couldn't identify. Rage? Fear? Look at her record. Operation Nightfall was a disaster, because of her poor judgment. For a moment I wondered if I was dreaming. The same man who taught me to field strip a rifle in the dark, who showed me how to read terrain like a book, was now trying to destroy everything I'd built in front of the very people who would decide my future. But the shame that flooded through me wasn't because I believed his word. I knew what I'd survived out there in the mountains of Afghanistan. I knew the price I'd paid to bring my team home when the mission went sideways. My humiliation came from something deeper. Watching the man who raised me to be a warrior now trying to tear me down in the most public way possible. The chair of the tribunal cleared her throat. Captain Chen, you'll have your opportunity to respond to these allegations. However, given the personal nature of this testimony, perhaps we should. No. The word came out stronger than I felt. I rose slowly, my dress shoes clicking against the polished floor. If Colonel Chen wants to question my fitness for command, then let's address this properly. The room fell into an eerie silence. No one moved. No one dared interrupt what felt like a family reckoning, disguised as a military proceeding. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the buttons on my jacket, but my voice remained steady. You want to see what Operation Nightfall caused? I asked, my eyes locked on my father's face. You want to understand why 12 soldiers came home alive when our intel said none of us should have? I could feel Admiral Rodriguez's eyes on me from the head of the tribunal panel. His expression was unreadable, but something in his posture suggested he sensed this moment would change everything. Slowly, deliberately, I unbuttoned my dress blues. The tribunal fell into absolute silence as I slid the jacket off my shoulder. My white undershirt clung to me, damp with nervous sweat, but I didn't hesitate. With careful precision, I lifted the fabric just high enough to reveal the truth I'd been carrying for 8 months. The gasps that filled the chamber were audible, sharp intakes of breath that seemed to echo off the walls. The scars across my ribs were impossible to ignore. Jagged lines that twisted like lightning frozen in flesh, angry red marks that told a story no after-action report could capture. But it was the 2 distinct bulges beneath my skin that made Admiral Rodriguez lean forward in his chair. Jesus Christ, someone whispered. The metal fragments were still there, permanent residents just beneath my ribs. The surgeons at Landstuhl had been blunt about it. Removing them would risk puncturing my lungs, potentially causing more damage than leaving them in place. So there they stayed, pieces of the IED that should have killed me now part of my body's landscape. My father staggered backward, his face draining of color. The righteous anger in his eyes vanished, replaced by something far more fragile. Horror, recognition, the sudden, crushing weight of understanding what his accusations had just collided with. These scars, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, are from the night I crawled through a minefield to reach Sergeant Martinez. The fragments under my skin are souvenirs from the IED that collapsed our forward operating bay. The burns on my back are from dragging Private Johnson through burning wreckage when the fuel depot got hit. I lowered my shirt slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled. You call me reckless, but I brought 12 soldiers home that night. 12 men and women who were supposed to die in those mountains. I carried some of them on my back while bleeding through my own uniform. I fought not for medals or commendations, but because leaving them behind was never an option. Admiral Rodriguez was the first to break the silence. His voice, usually commanding and firm, came out softer than I'd ever heard it. Captain Chen, we weren't aware of the extent of your injuries. I straightened my uniform, tucking my shirt back in with steady hands. The medical reports are classified, but the scars don't lie about what happened out there. My father collapsed into his seat as if his legs had given out. He stared at the floor, his broad shoulders sagging under the weight of his own words. The man who had spent his career building other officers up, had just tried to tear down his own daughter without knowing the full cost of her service. The official report lists Operation Nightfall as a tactical success with minimal casualties, Admiral Rodriguez said, consulting a folder in front of him, but the details were heavily redacted due to ongoing intelligence concerns. Captain, we need to hear your version of what really happened. I nodded, straightening my jacket. The hardest part was over. The truth was out in the open now, but telling the story, reliving that night, step by step, would require me to go back to a place I'd been trying to forget for 8 months. It started 3 days before the operation, I began, my voice finding its rhythm. We received intelligence about a high-value target in the Spingar Mountains, Taliban commander named Hakim Rashid, supposedly planning attacks on coalition supply route. The mission brief made it sound routine, fast in, fast out. Minimal resistance expected. I paused, letting my mind drift back to that cramped briefing room in Kandahar, but something felt wrong from the beginning. The intel was too clean, too precise. In my experience, when the enemy's location comes wrapped in a neat package, there's usually a reason. The tribunal members were taking notes now, their attention completely focused on my words. Even my father had lifted his head, though he still couldn't meet my eye. My team consisted of 12 soldiers, I continued, some of the best I'd ever worked with. Staff Sergeant Martinez had 3 tours under his belt. Corporal Johnson was our communications specialist, could make a radio work with nothing but duct tape and prayer. Private Williams was 19 years old and scared, but he'd proven himself reliable under pressure. The names felt heavy in my mouth, not because they were gone, they'd all made it home, eventually, but because of what we'd all lost in those mountains. Innocence, maybe, or the belief that someone always had our backs. We inserted at 0200 hours, 12 clicks from the target location. The plan was simple: establish overwatch positions, confirm the target's presence, and call in an airstrike, clean and surgical. Nobody was supposed to get close enough to the compound to be in danger. I looked directly at Admiral Rodriguez. The first sign of trouble came 40 minutes after insertion. Williams picked up radio chatter that didn't match our intelligence briefing. There were supposed to be 8 to 10 fighters in that compound. Williams was hearing at least 30 voices on their communications. Did you abort the mission? One of the tribunal members asked. I should have, I admit, but our orders were specific: confirm the target and eliminate the threat. Command had been tracking Rashid for months. This was our best shot at him, so I made the call to continue the mission, but with modified parameters. Instead of overwatch, we'd conduct close reconnaissance to get an accurate count of enemy forces before calling in the strike. The decision that had saved our lives initially, but ultimately led to disaster. We moved closer to the compound, establishing 3 observation points around the perimeter. That's when we discovered the intelligence wasn't just wrong, it was deliberately false. Admiral Rodriguez's pen stopped moving. Explain. The compound wasn't a Taliban stronghold, it was a meeting place for local tribal leaders trying to negotiate peace talks with the Afghan government. There were women and children inside, families. The only weapons we could identify were personal protection, old rifles and pistols that any rural family might have. The room seemed to grow colder. We'd been sent to eliminate a target that didn't exist, to attack people who were trying to end the fighting, not escalate it. What did you do? Admiral Rodriguez asked quietly. I called it in, reported our findings and requested confirmation of the target. Command came back within 10 minutes with the same orders: eliminate the threat. When I questioned the intelligence again, I was told that the information was verified and current, and that I was to proceed as directed. I could see the pieces clicking together in the Admiral's mind. This wasn't just a story about a mission gone wrong, it was about something much larger and more troubling. That's when the real nightmare began, I continued. While we were trying to figure out how to proceed, the compound came under attack. Not from us, from actual Taliban fighters who had been tracking our movement since insertion. We weren't the hunters anymore, we were the prey. The memory of that moment still made my chest tight. The attack started with mortars. 3 rounds hit the compound before we even heard the launch. Then small arms fire from at least 4 different positions. The families inside were trapped, and we were caught in the open between the attackers and their target. I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering the sound of automatic weapons fire echoing off the mountain wall. I had a choice to make: follow orders and call in an airstrike that would eliminate everyone in that compound, including the innocents, or disobey direct orders and try to extract the civilians while engaging the actual enemy. You chose to protect the civilians, Admiral Rodriguez. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. We moved to defensive positions around the compound and began engaging the Taliban forces. The fighting lasted 4 hours. We were outnumbered 3 to 1, low on ammunition, and had no backup coming, but we held the line. The rest of the story poured out of me like blood from an old wound. The running firefight through the mountains, the IED that collapsed our temporary shelter, Sergeant Martinez stepping on a mine while trying to reach wounded civilians, the moment when our communications went dead and we realized we were completely on our own. By dawn, we'd neutralized the attacking force, I said, but the cost was severe. Martinez lost his leg below the knee, Johnson had shrapnel wounds across his back and arm, Williams took a bullet through his shoulder, and I gestured toward my ribs. Well, you've seen the evidence. How did you get out? One of the tribunal members asked. We walked, carried the wounded, and walked 37 kilometers to the nearest coalition outpost. It took us 18 hours, moving only at night and hiding during the day. We had no radio, no GPS, and no extraction plan, just a map and a compass. I straightened my shoulders. All 12 soldiers under my command made it home alive. The civilians we protected survived the attack, and the Taliban cell that had been operating in that region was eliminated. The mission was a success by any reasonable measure, except you disobeyed direct orders, my father said quietly from the gallery. It was the first time he'd spoken since his outburst, and his voice carried none of its earlier conviction. I turned to face him fully for the first time since the hearing began. Yes, sir, I disobeyed orders that would have resulted in the deaths of innocent people based on false intelligence. I chose to protect American values rather than follow American orders, and I'd make the same choice again. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Admiral Rodriguez exchanged glances with the other tribunal members before speaking. Captain Chen, the charges against you include insubordination, failure to follow direct orders, and reckless endangerment of your unit. However, the circumstances you've described raise significant questions about the intelligence failure that led to this situation. We'll need to review the classified details of Operation Nightfall before proceeding. He paused, his gaze moving from me to my father and back again. This tribunal is recessed pending further investigation. Captain, you're restricted to base until we reconvene. As the tribunal members filed out, I remained standing at attention until the room was nearly empty. Only my father and I remained, separated by 20 feet of polished floor and a lifetime of complicated history. Sarah, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to face him, my expression neutral despite the storm of emotions churning in my chest. Colonel, he stepped closer, and I could see the conflict playing out across his weathered features. This was a man who'd spent his entire career believing in the system, trusting that orders came from people who had access to better information and clearer judgment. Watching him grapple with the possibility that the system had failed was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. I didn't know, he said, about your injuries, about what really happened out there. The reports were classified, I replied evenly, above your clearance level. He winced at the professional distance in my voice. That's not. I should have trusted you, should have known you'd never put your soldiers at risk without good reason. I studied his face, looking for the father who'd taught me to value honor above everything else. You taught me that loyalty flows both ways, Dad, that a leader's first responsibility is to the people under their command. I was following your lessons. Then why did you never tell me what really happened? The question hung between us like smoke. How could I explain that I'd tried, in the first weeks after coming home, that every time I'd started to tell him about the civilians in the compound, about the choice I'd had to make, he'd steered the conversation toward duty and following orders, that I'd learned to keep my doubts and moral struggles to myself, because he'd made it clear that questioning orders was a sign of weakness. Because I knew you wouldn't understand, I said finally. You've always believed that good soldiers follow orders without question, but sometimes good soldiers have to choose between following orders and doing what's right. He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about the difference between being a good soldier and being a good person. I used to think they were the same thing. They should be, I said. But they're not always. We stood in silence for a moment, two soldiers from different generations, trying to bridge a gap that had been years in the making. Finally, he spoke again. I'm proud of you, Sarah. I should have said that first, before anything else. I'm proud of what you did out there, and I'm ashamed of what I said today. The words hit me harder than I'd expected. I'd been waiting to hear them for months, but now that they were out in the open, they felt insufficient to heal the damage that had been done. Thank you. This isn't just about us anymore. There are questions that need answers about how that intelligence failure happened, about who sent us to attack innocent people and why. His expression darkened. You think it was deliberate? I think someone wanted that compound destroyed, and they didn't care who was inside when it happened. The question is why. 3 days later, I was summoned to Admiral Rodriguez's office. The space was sparse and functional, dominated by a large desk covered in file folders marked with various levels of classification. Charts showing unit deployments and mission timelines covered one wall, while another displayed commendations and photographs from the Admiral's 30-year career. Captain Chen, please sit, he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. His tone was neutral, but I could see tension in the set of his shoulders. I took my seat and waited, hands folded in my lap, while he organized the papers in front of him. We've completed our review of Operation Nightfall, he began. What we found raises serious concerns about intelligence protocols and chain of command decisions. But before we discuss that, I need you to understand something about the political context surrounding this mission. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. The target you were sent to eliminate, Hakim Rashid, was real. He was a Taliban commander responsible for attacks on coalition forces. But our intelligence placed him in that compound based on intercepted communications that were, how should I put this, strategically enhanced. Enhanced, sir. Deliberately altered to make it appear that Rashid was meeting with local collaborators, when in fact he was nowhere near that location. The tribal leaders you encountered were exactly what they appeared to be, civilians attempting to negotiate peace in their region. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who altered the intelligence? Admiral Rodriguez opened one of the folders and pulled out a series of photographs. These were taken by satellite surveillance on the day of your mission. They show the actual location where Rashid was meeting with his lieutenants, approximately 50 kilometers from where you were deployed. The images showed a different compound entirely, one that matched the tactical briefings we'd received. Armed fighters, weapons caches, the clear signs of militant activity. Everything that had been absent from the location we'd been sent to attack. Someone in the intelligence chain deliberately provided false coordinates, I said, the implications crashing over me like a wave. It appears that way. The question is whether this was an error in translation, a failure in verification, or something more deliberate. I studied the photographs again, comparing them to my memories of that night. Sir, with respect, this wasn't an error. The intelligence we received was too detailed, too specific to be wrong by accident. Someone wanted us to attack that compound, knowing there were civilians inside. That's a serious accusation, Captain. Yes, sir, but consider the alternative explanation, that our intelligence apparatus is so fundamentally broken, that we regularly send soldiers to attack the wrong targets by accident. Which possibility is more troubling? Admiral Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the photographs. We've identified the source of the altered intelligence, a contractor working with the Defense Intelligence Agency named Marcus Webb. He's been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. A contract, the word tasted bitter. not military personnel. No, Webb works for Meridian Solutions, a private intelligence firm that provides analysis and target verification for special operations. He's been handling intelligence packages for operations in your sector for the past 18 months. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. How many other missions has he been involved with? That's being investigated now. But Captain, there's something else you need to know. Webb didn't act alone. The false intelligence package required approval at multiple levels before it reached your command. Someone in our own intelligence structure signed off on sending you to attack civilians. The room seemed to grow smaller. Who? We're still working on that, but there's a paper trail, and we're following it. He closed the folder and looked directly at me. In the meantime, you need to know that your actions during Operation Nightfall are being reviewed for commendation, not court-martial. You made the right choice under impossible circumstances. What about the insubordination charges? Dropped. Along with the other charges against you, you'll be restored to full active duty effective immediately. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was mixed with anger. And my father's testimony. Admiral Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. Colonel Chen has requested a meeting with me to discuss his statements to the tribunal. I believe he's recognized that his personal concerns clouded his professional judgment. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The vindication I'd wanted was finally here, but the cost had been higher than I'd anticipated. The relationship with my father, the months of doubt and second-guessing. The knowledge that someone had deliberately sent my team into harm's way, none of that could be undone with a simple restoration of duty. There's one more thing, Admiral Rodriguez said. We'd like you to assist with the investigation into the intelligence failure. Your first-hand knowledge of what happened that night could be crucial in identifying how deep this problem goes. Of course, sir, but I want to understand something first. If this was a deliberate attempt to cause casualties, civilian or military, then we're not just talking about intelligence failure, we're talking about war crimes. Yes, he said quietly, we are. The investigation that followed consumed the next 3 months of my life. What began as a review of a single mission, gradually expanded into something much larger and more troubling. The paper trail, Admiral Rodriguez had mentioned, led through a network of contractors, private intelligence firms, and defense industry connections that stretched across multiple theaters of operation. Marcus Webb, the contractor who'd provided the false intelligence, had disappeared. His employment records with Meridian Solutions showed a pattern of reassignment to different projects whenever questions arose about his work. He'd been involved in intelligence packages for operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Somalia, always in roles that gave him access to target verification and coordinate confirmation. But Webb was just one piece of a larger puzzle. The investigation revealed that Meridian Solutions had contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars with various Defense Department agencies. They provided everything from language translation to tactical analysis, and their personnel were embedded throughout the intelligence community. I spent hours in windowless conference rooms, reviewing classified documents and providing testimony about every detail of Operation Nightfall. The investigators were thorough and professional, but I could see the frustration building as the scope of the problem became clear. Captain Chen, said Agent Sarah Martinez from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, we've identified 17 missions over the past 2 years where Meridian Solutions provided intelligence that resulted in civilian casualties or failed objective. Operation Nightfall was neither the first nor the worst of these incidents. The conference room felt suddenly cold. How many people died? 43 confirmed civilian deaths, unknown number of military casualties that could have been prevented with accurate intelligence. She slid a thick folder across the table. These are the mission summaries. All of them follow a similar pattern, clean intelligence packages that target locations with minimal tactical value, followed by complications that escalate casualty rates. I opened the folder and began reading. Each mission report told a similar story to ours, soldiers sent to eliminate threats that didn't exist, or that existed in different locations entirely. The pattern was clear, once you knew to look for it. This is systematic. Someone has been deliberately feeding false intelligence into our operations for years. That's our assessment as well. The question is why? Agent Martinez pulled out another set of documents. We've been analyzing Meridian Solutions' financial records. They're paid based on the number of intelligence packages they provide, but they also receive performance bonuses tied to mission outcomes. Specifically, they receive additional compensation when missions result in enemy casualties or successful target elimination. They're incentivized to provide intelligence that results in combat, I said, the implications making my stomach turn. The more fighting, the more money they make. It gets worse. Meridian Solutions has significant investments in defense contractors that manufacture ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Every mission that results in extended combat generates revenue for companies they have financial stakes in. I stared at the documents, feeling sick. They're profiting from American casualties, from dead soldiers and dead civilians. We believe so. But proving it in court will require more evidence than we currently have. Webb's disappearance has made it difficult to establish direct intent. Over the following weeks, I learned more about the military-industrial complex than I'd ever wanted to know. The web of relationships between private contractors, defense manufacturers, and government agencies was so complex that it was often impossible to tell where legitimate business ended and corruption began. But the investigation also revealed something else. I wasn't the only officer who'd questioned orders based on suspicious intelligence. There were others, scattered across different units and theaters, who'd raised concerns about missions that didn't make tactical sense. Most of them had been quietly reassigned or encouraged to retire early. The pattern suggested something even more troubling than profit motive. Someone was systematically removing competent officers who asked too many questions, replacing them with personnel more willing to follow orders without questioning their source or validity. My father appeared at my quarters one evening in late September, looking older than I'd ever seen him. His usually perfect uniform was slightly rumpled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Sarah," he said when I opened the door, "we need to talk." I stepped aside to let him in, noting the way his shoulders sagged as he crossed the threshold. This wasn't the commanding presence I'd grown up with. This was a man carrying the weight of uncomfortable truths. "I've been following the investigation," he said without preamble. "What they're finding about Meridian Solutions and the intelligence failure. I need you to know that I've been doing some digging of my own." I gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing, pacing across my small living room like a caged animal. 20 years ago, when I was working in the Pentagon, I was approached by a representative from Meridian Solutions. They were just getting started then, trying to build relationships with military decision-makers. They offered me a consulting position after retirement. Good money, minimal responsibilities, just my name on their advisory board. I felt my stomach drop. "I turned them down," he said quickly. "But not for the right reasons. I turned them down because I thought it would look bad for my career, having private sector connections while still on active duty. I didn't question what they were actually doing or why they wanted my endorsement." He stopped pacing and looked directly at me. "But other officers didn't turn them down. Good officers, people I respected, took those consulting positions. And over the years, I watched as those same officers ended up in positions where they could influence intelligence assessments and mission planning." "You're saying Meridian Solutions has been placing their people in key positions for decades?" "I'm saying they've been very good at identifying which officers might be sympathetic to their approach. They offer consulting fees, post-retirement employment, even investments in their subsidiary companies. Nothing illegal, nothing that violates ethics rules on paper, but it creates relationships and obligations." I sat down heavily, the implications washing over me. "How many officers are we talking about?" "I've identified at least 30 in positions that could influence intelligence flow, maybe more." "Sarah, this thing goes deeper than anyone realizes." The investigation took on new urgency after my father's revelations. Agent Martinez and her team began mapping the network of current and former military personnel with financial ties to Meridian Solutions and its subsidiary companies. What they found was staggering. Nearly 15% of senior intelligence officers had some form of business relationship with companies in the Meridian network. Most were legitimate consulting agreements or post-retirement employment, but the cumulative effect was to create a culture where questioning certain intelligence sources was discouraged. It's not a conspiracy in the traditional sense, Agent Martinez explained during one of our briefings. It's more like a systemic bias that's been built into the intelligence community over time. Officers learn not to ask too many questions about certain contractors, because it could hurt their career prospects. But the false intelligence, I said, the deliberate targeting of civilians, that goes beyond bias. We believe that was Webb acting on his own, or possibly with a small group of co-conspirators. But his ability to operate undetected for so long was enabled by the broader culture of unquestioning acceptance. The case against Meridian Solutions was building, but slowly. Corporate lawyers and government bureaucrats created layers of protection that made it difficult to establish criminal intent. Meanwhile, soldiers continued to deploy on missions based on intelligence that might or might not be accurate. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former Meridian Solutions employee named Dr. Jennifer Walsh contacted Agent Martinez through a lawyer, offering to testify in exchange for protection from prosecution. Walsh had worked as a senior analyst for the company and had access to internal communications about intelligence manipulation. "She's scared," Agent Martinez told me during a secure phone call. Apparently, Webb wasn't the only contractor involved in falsifying intelligence. There was a whole department dedicated to what they called strategic target enhancement, basically making low-value targets appear more threatening to justify military action. How long was this going on? According to Walsh, at least 5 years, maybe longer. She has emails, financial records, even recordings of meetings where company executives discussed the profitability of extended combat operations. Dr. Walsh's testimony was devastating to Meridian Solutions. She provided detailed evidence of a systematic effort to manipulate intelligence assessments in ways that would maximize combat engagement and, therefore, corporate profit. The Strategic Target Enhancement Program had been responsible for Operation Nightfall, and dozens of other missions where soldiers had been sent to fight unnecessary battles. But the most damning revelation was that company executives had been tracking casualty rates and using them as metrics for measuring the success of their intelligence manipulation. Higher casualty rates were seen as proof that their enhanced intelligence was creating more actionable military engagements. They were treating dead soldiers like a performance indicator, I said to Agent Martinez after reviewing Dr. Walsh's evidence. And they were paying bonuses to analysts who produced intelligence that resulted in extended combat operations, regardless of the strategic value of those operations. The trials that followed made national headlines. Marcus Webb was eventually located in a non-extradition country, but several other Meridian Solutions executives were arrested and charged with conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. The company itself was dissolved, its contracts cancelled, and its assets frozen pending resolution of multiple lawsuits. My father testified before a congressional committee about the culture of contractor influence within the military intelligence community. His recommendations for reform included mandatory disclosure of all financial relationships between military personnel and defense contractors, as well as independent oversight of intelligence verification process. We created a system where questioning certain sources of information was seen as disloyalty, he told the committee. That has to change. Our soldiers deserve intelligence they can trust, from sources that don't profit from their debt. The reforms that emerged from the investigation were comprehensive but came too late for the soldiers who died in unnecessary battles over the previous 5 years. Operation Nightfall became a case study in military academies, an example of how good soldiers can be put in impossible positions by systemic failures in the intelligence community. For me, the vindication was complete, but bittersweet. My military record was cleared. My actions during Operation Nightfall were officially commended, and I was promoted to major. But the knowledge that we'd been betrayed by our own systems, that profit motives had been placed above soldier safety, left scars that couldn't be healed by official recognition. The fragments of metal still embedded in my ribs served as daily reminders of that night in the mountain. But they also reminded me of something else, that sometimes doing the right thing requires disobeying orders from people who don't have all the information or the right priorities. 6 months after the trials concluded, I received a new assignment, developing training programs for intelligence officers, focused on critical thinking and ethical decision-making. The irony wasn't lost on me. The soldier who'd been court-martialed for questioning orders was now tasked with teaching others when and how to question the information they received. My father and I began meeting regularly, trying to rebuild a relationship that had been damaged by years of miscommunication and different perspectives on duty and loyalty. It wasn't easy. We'd both been shaped by military cultures that valued obedience over inquiry. but we were learning to find common ground in our shared commitment to protecting soldiers from unnecessary harm. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me during one of our conversations, "about the difference between being a good soldier and being a good person. I think you were right that they should be the same thing, but they're not always. The system is supposed to make them the same thing," I replied. "When it doesn't, we have to choose which one we want to be, and you chose to be a good person first. I chose to protect the people under my command. Everything else was secondary." He nodded slowly. "I should have understood that from the beginning. I should have trusted your judgment instead of defending a system that was failing you." The conversation marked a turning point in our relation. We were finally able to talk honestly about the pressures and expectations that had shaped both of our careers, and about the courage required to stand up to institutional failures, even when it meant standing alone. A year later, I was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony for a new class of military intelligence officers. Standing at the podium, looking out at the young faces in the audience, I thought about everything that had brought me to that moment. "The most important lesson I can share with you," I told them, "is that your primary loyalty should always be to the truth, and to the people you serve with. There will be times when those loyalties conflict with orders or institutional pressure. When that happens, remember that being a good soldier means protecting those who depend on you, even if it costs you personally." I touched my ribs unconsciously, feeling the familiar ache of the metal fragments beneath my skin. These scars remind me every day that the price of courage is often paid in blood and pain, but the price of cowardice is paid by others, by the soldiers who trust you to give them accurate information, by the civilians who depend on you to distinguish between combatants and innocents, by the families who send their children to serve believing that the system will protect them. The auditorium was silent, the weight of responsibility settling over the new officers like a heavy blanket. "You'll face moments when following orders feels easier than questioning them," I continued, "when going along with the system seems safer than challenging. In those moments, remember that your oath was to support and defend the Constitution, not to blindly follow any particular order or protect any particular institution. Sometimes defending the Constitution means protecting it from those who would corrupt it for their own purposes." After the ceremony, several young officers approached me with questions about how to recognize bad intelligence, how to question orders without destroying their careers, how to balance loyalty to superiors with responsibility to subordinates. Their questions reminded me of my own early years in the military, when everything seemed clear-cut and the chain of command appeared to be an infallible system for ensuring that the right decisions were made. "The hardest part," I told one earnest second lieutenant, "is learning to trust your own judgment when it conflicts with official sources, but remember that you're often closer to the ground truth than the people giving you orders. Your observations and instincts matter, especially when they're telling you that something doesn't add up." That evening, I called my father to tell him about the graduation ceremony, and the conversations I'd had with the new officers. "They're asking the right questions," I said, "but I worry about what happens when they get to their first assignments and discover how much pressure there is to conform." "That's why what you're doing matters," he replied. "Every officer you train to think critically, to question bad intelligence, to put soldier safety above institutional loyalty. That's one more person who might prevent the next Operation Nightfall." I hope so. But it's going to take more than training programs to fix the underlying problems. Change happens one person at a time, Sarah. You changed me. You changed the investigation team. You changed the way Congress thinks about contractor oversight. That ripples outward in ways you might never see. As we talked, I realized that my relationship with my father had become something neither of us had expected. A partnership based on shared lessons learned from failure and mutual respect for the courage required to admit mistakes and change course. The investigation into Meridian Solutions had concluded, the trials were over, and new oversight mechanisms were in place to prevent similar intelligence manipulation. But the larger questions about military culture, contractor influence, and the balance between loyalty and conscience remained ongoing challenges. 2 years later, I received an unexpected phone call from Agent Martinez. She'd left the Defense Criminal Investigative Service and was working with a congressional oversight committee focused on defense contractor accountability. "We've uncovered something you need to know about," she said. "Remember Dr. Walsh, the Meridian Solutions whistleblower? She's been tracking other companies that might be using similar tactics to manipulate military operations. What did she find?" At least 3 other major defense contractors have departments that appear to be providing enhanced intelligence designed to increase combat engagement. It looks like Meridian Solutions wasn't unique. It was part of a broader pattern of corporate manipulation of military decision-making. The news hit me like a physical blow. We'd solved one piece of the puzzle, but the larger problem was still metastasizing throughout the defense industry. What can we do about it? We're building cases, but it's slow work. These companies have learned from Meridian's mistakes. They're more careful about documentation, more sophisticated about creating plausible deniability. But we need people like you, officers with credibility and first-hand experience, to help identify suspicious patterns in intelligence products. I agreed to assist with the investigation, knowing that it would mean years more of reviewing classified documents, providing testimony, and reliving the nightmare of Operation Nightfall over and over again. But the alternative, allowing other soldiers to be manipulated into unnecessary battles, was unacceptable. The work was exhausting and often discouraging. Each new case revealed the same pattern: intelligence analysts with financial incentives to exaggerate threats, military officers too busy or too trusting to question the information they received, and soldiers paying the price for decisions made by people who would never face enemy fire themselves. But there were victories too. Several officers came forward with their own stories of suspicious intelligence and questionable orders. New oversight procedures were implemented to verify contractor-provided intelligence through independent sources, and a new generation of military leaders emerged who understood that healthy skepticism was not disloyalty but an essential part of protecting the people under their command. My father became an unexpected ally in this work. His congressional testimony had made him a credible voice for reform, and he used his platform to advocate for stronger oversight of defense contractors and better protection for military whistleblowers. I spent 30 years believing that questioning orders was a sign of weakness, he told one congressional hearing. But my daughter taught me that questioning bad orders is a sign of strength, and that blind obedience can be more dangerous than healthy skepticism. The relationship between us continued to evolve as we worked together on these issues. We'd found common ground in our shared commitment to protecting soldiers from unnecessary harm, but we also had to navigate the lingering effects of years of miscommunication and different perspectives on military duty. I still believe in the chain of command, he said during one of our conversations. But I also believe that commanders have a responsibility to ensure that the orders they give are based on accurate information and sound reason. When they fail in that responsibility, subordinates have not just the right, but the duty to push back. That's a big change from what you taught me growing up. Growing up, I thought the most important thing was teaching you to be a good soldier according to the traditional definition. But being a good soldier in the 21st century requires different skills than it did when I was coming up. The threats are more complex. The information environment is more polluted, and the consequences of bad decisions are higher. What would you tell young officers now? I'd tell them that courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it's charging an enemy position under fire. Sometimes it's standing up in a briefing room and saying that the intelligence doesn't make sense. Both require the same fundamental willingness to put mission and people above personal safety. 5 years after Operation Nightfall, I was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of a new unit focused on intelligence verification and mission analysis. The unit's mandate was to provide independent assessment of high-risk operations, essentially serving as a check on intelligence products that might be compromised by contractor influence or other biases. It was challenging work that required balancing healthy skepticism with operational necessity. We couldn't question every piece of intelligence or second-guess every mission. That would paralyze military operations. But we could identify patterns that suggested systematic problems and flag operations that seemed designed more to generate profit than achieve strategic objectives. My team included several other officers who'd had experiences similar to mine. People who'd questioned orders, faced professional consequences, and ultimately been vindicated when broader investigations revealed systemic problems. We understood the pressures that discouraged critical thinking and the courage required to challenge official narratives. The goal isn't to prevent all military action, I explained to my team during our first meeting. It's to ensure that when we do commit forces to combat, it's for clear strategic purposes based on accurate intelligence, not because someone has a financial incentive to keep the war machine running. One of our first major cases, involved a proposed operation in East Africa that bore disturbing similarities to Operation Nightfall. The intelligence suggested a high-value terrorist target in a compound that aerial reconnaissance showed was primarily occupied by displaced families. The contractor providing the intelligence had significant investments in companies that would profit from extended military engagement in the region. "This looks familiar," said Major Williams, one of my team leaders who'd been involved in investigating the Meridian Solutions case. "Too familiar," I agreed. "Let's dig deeper." Our investigation revealed that the intelligence was based on a single source, a local informant, whose information couldn't be verified through independent means. The proposed target location was indeed a terrorist safehouse, but it had been abandoned weeks earlier when the families moved in seeking shelter from regional fighting. "Someone wants us to attack refugees," Major Williams said after reviewing the evidence. "The question is whether it's deliberate manipulation or just sloppy intelligence work. Given the contractor's financial interests, I'd lean toward deliberate." We recommended against the operation and suggested alternative approaches to locating the actual terrorist cell. The recommendation was initially met with resistance from commanders who'd already committed resources to the mission, but eventually cooler heads prevailed and the operation was cancelled. 2 weeks later, local sources reported that the terrorist cell had been located and eliminated by regional forces acting on better intelligence. No civilians were harmed, and the strategic objective was achieved without risking American lives in an unnecessary battle. "That's how it's supposed to work," Major Williams observed. "Yes, but notice how much resistance we got to asking basic questions about the intelligence. The system is still biased toward action over analysis. Old habits die hard, but we're changing the culture one mission at a time." The work my unit was doing gradually gained recognition throughout the military community. Other services began establishing similar verification units, and the concept of independent intelligence assessment became standard practice for high-risk operations. But the most satisfying part of the job was the feedback we received from field commanders whose units had been protected from unnecessary risks by our analysis. Every operation we prevented from going forward based on flawed intelligence was potentially lives saved, families kept intact, careers preserved. "You realize what you've accomplished here," my father said during one of his visits to my unit. "You've institutionalized the kind of critical thinking that got you in trouble 5 years ago. It took a while, but the system eventually learned that questioning orders can be more valuable than blindly following them. And you were willing to pay the personal cost to prove that point." I touched my ribs unconsciously, feeling the familiar presence of the metal fragments that had become part of my daily reality. The personal cost was worth it if it means other soldiers won't have to go through what my team went through in Afghanistan. "I'm proud of you, Sarah, not just for what you accomplished, but for how you accomplished it. You could have become bitter about the way you were treated, but instead you channeled that experience into something constructive." "I had good teachers," I said, looking directly at him, "even when they were teaching lessons they didn't intend to teach." He smiled at that, understanding the complicated nature of the education we'd both received through the process of investigating Operation Nightfall and its aftermath. As evening fell and my father prepared to leave, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. The scars on my ribs would always be there, reminders of a night when everything went wrong and the courage required to make difficult choices under impossible circumstances. But they were also reminders of something else, that institutions are only as strong as the people who are willing to hold them accountable, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against external enemies, but against internal corruption and complacency. The young officers graduating from military academies today would face different challenges than the ones my generation had encountered. The threats were evolving, the information environment was becoming more complex, and the temptations for institutional corruption were growing more sophisticated. But they would also have better tools for recognizing and responding to these challenges. The oversight mechanisms we'd put in place, the training programs focused on critical thinking, the cultural changes that made questioning bad intelligence acceptable rather than career-ending, all of these were part of the legacy of Operation Nightfall and the investigation that followed. "The next generation will do better than we did," I told my father as we said goodbye. "I believe that, but only because people like you were willing to pay the price to make it possible." That night, alone in my quarters, I stood before the mirror and lifted my shirt to look at the scars that had started this entire journey. They were less angry now, faded from red to white, but still visible proof of what happened when soldiers were sent into battle based on false intelligence. I thought about the 12 soldiers who'd served under my command that night in Afghanistan. All of them had eventually recovered from their physical injuries, though some carried psychological scars that would take longer to heal. We'd stayed in touch over the years, bonding over the shared experience of surviving something that should have destroyed us. "You saved us," Sergeant Martinez had told me at a reunion gathering the previous year, not just that night in the mountains, but afterward, when you refused to let them bury the truth about what happened. "We saved each other," I'd replied. "That's what soldiers do." "No, that's what good soldiers do, and you taught us the difference." The distinction was important. I realized being a good soldier wasn't about blind obedience or unquestioning loyalty to authority. It was about taking care of the people who depended on you, making smart decisions under pressure, and having the courage to stand up for what was right even when it was personally costly. My phone rang, interrupting my reflection. It was Agent Martinez, calling from her new position with the Congressional Oversight Committee. "Sarah, I wanted to give you an update on our latest investigation. We've just arrested the CEO of Blackstone Analytics for conspiracy to manipulate military intelligence." Dr. Walsh's information was crucial in building the case. "How many companies does that make now?" 7 major defense contractors with criminal charges related to intelligence manipulation. Probably dozens more that have cleaned up their acts to avoid prosecution. "It's progress," I said. "But I worry about the ones we haven't caught yet. That's why this work is never really finished. But each company we shut down, each executive we prosecute, each procedure we put in place to prevent abuse, all of that makes it harder for the next Marcus Webb to manipulate our soldiers into unnecessary battles." After we hung up, I realized that Agent Martinez was right about the ongoing nature of this work. There would always be people and organizations willing to profit from conflict. Always new ways to manipulate information for financial gain. Always pressures that encouraged conformity over critical thinking. But there would also always be soldiers willing to ask hard questions, to challenge dubious orders, to put the safety of their people above their own career prospects. The system was only as strong as the people who were willing to hold it accountable, and that accountability was an ongoing responsibility rather than a one-time achievement. The metal fragments in my ribs pulsed with a familiar ache as I prepared for bed. They'd been part of me for so long now that I sometimes forgot they were there, but they served as daily reminders of the price of trust misplaced and the value of trust earned through shared sacrifice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new intelligence products to analyze, new officers to train in the art of healthy skepticism. The work would continue because it had to continue, because the alternative was to let future soldiers pay the price for institutional failures that could be prevented with courage and vigilance. As I turned off the lights, I thought about something my father had said during his congressional testimony. The military exists to protect democracy, not to serve corporate interests. When we lose sight of that distinction, we betray everyone who has ever worn the uniform. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, through watching his daughter pay the price for his own institutional blindness. But he'd learned it, and he'd used his platform to ensure that others could learn it without paying the same price. That was how progress really happened, not through grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but through individual people choosing to do better, to question more, to prioritize principle over convenience. It was slow work, often frustrating work, but it was the only way to build institutions worthy of the people who served them. The scars on my ribs would always be there, but they'd become something different than marks of trauma. They were proof that survival was possible, that integrity could triumph over corruption, and that sometimes the most important battles were won not on distant battlefields, but in conference rooms and congressional hearing chambers where the future of military culture was decided. Outside my window, the lights of the base twinkled in the darkness like stars. Somewhere out there, young soldiers were preparing for their first deployments, trusting that the intelligence they received would be accurate, and the orders they followed would be worthy of their sacrifice. That trust was sacred, and protecting it was worth every scar, every sleepless night, every professional risk I'd taken to ensure that the truth eventually came to light. The work would continue because it had to continue, and I would be part of it for as long as I was able to serve. The metal fragments in my ribs were no longer symbols of betrayal, they'd become symbols of accountability, reminders that someone was always watching, always questioning, always ready to stand up when institutions failed. The people they were supposed to protect. That was the real victory of Operation Nightfall. Not just that justice was served in one particular case, but that a culture of accountability had been established that would protect future generations of soldiers from similar betrayal. It was a victory measured not in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in lives preserved and trust maintained. And that, I realized as sleep finally came, was the kind of victory that lasted. 10 years after Operation Nightfall, I stood before a new class of intelligence officers at the Defense Intelligence Agency. The audience was different this time. These weren't just military personnel, but a mix of soldiers, civilians, and contractors who would be responsible for providing accurate intelligence to operations around the world. The lesson of Operation Nightfall, I told them, isn't that you should distrust all intelligence or question every order. It's that you have a responsibility to ensure that the information you provide is accurate, that the analysis you conduct is honest, and that the recommendations you make prioritize mission success and soldier safety over any other consideration. I touched my ribs unconsciously, feeling the familiar presence of the metal fragments that had become part of my identity. These scars remind me every day that intelligence failures have real consequences. They're not just data points or analytical exercises. They're life and death decisions that affect real people with families and futures. A young civilian analyst raised her hand. How do you balance healthy skepticism with the need to trust your sources and support operational requirements? That's the right question, I said. The balance comes from understanding that your job isn't to prevent military action. It's to ensure that when action is taken, it's based on the best possible information. Sometimes that means pushing back on pressure to provide quick answers or convenient assessments. Sometimes it means admitting that you don't have enough information to make a recommendation. Another student, a Marine lieutenant, asked, "What do you do when your analysis conflicts with what commanders want to hear?" "You tell them anyway," I replied, "but you also make sure you can defend your analysis with solid evidence and clear reason. Remember that commanders are making decisions based on your information. They deserve your best work, not what you think they want to hear." The questions continued for another hour, covering everything from technical analysis methods to ethical decision-making under pressure. These students understood that they were inheriting a system that had been reformed and strengthened, but they also understood that maintaining that improvement would require constant vigilance. After the presentation, I was approached by Dalosh, the former Meridian Solutions whistleblower, who now worked as an independent consultant helping to identify potential intelligence manipulation in contractor products. "Your story has become required reading in ethics courses," she told me. "Not just in military schools, but in business programs and policy studies. People need to understand how personal courage can change institutional culture." I hope they also understand that it wasn't just individual courage, I replied. It was a lot of people choosing to do the right thing, even when it was professionally risky. Agent Martinez, my father, Admiral Rodriguez, none of us could have accomplished this alone. That's true, but someone had to be willing to take the first. Someone had to be willing to stand up in that tribunal and show those scars, knowing what it might cost personally. I nodded, thinking about that moment 10 years earlier, when I'd made the decision to reveal the physical evidence of what Operation Nightfall had really caused. It had seemed like a desperate gamble at the time, but it had been the key that unlocked everything that followed. "The system is better now," Dr. Walsh continued. "Not perfect, but better. There are safeguards in place that didn't exist before. People know what to look for, and there's a culture that supports questioning bad intelligence rather than punishing it. For now," I said, "but institutions have short memories. It'll be up to the next generation to maintain these reforms and adapt them to new threats. That's why what you're doing matters. Every officer you train, every analyst you teach to think critically, every contractor you remind about ethical responsibilities. That's how lasting change happens." That evening, I received a call from my father, now in his 70s, but still actively involved in defense policy reform as a consultant and advocate. "How did the presentation go?" he asked. "Good. The students are asking the right question. They understand that intelligence work is about more than just collecting and analyzing data. It's about the responsibility that comes with influencing life and death decisions." "I've been thinking about the 10-year anniversary," he said, "about how much has changed since that night in Afghanistan." "A lot has changed," I agreed. but some things haven't. Soldiers are still being deployed to dangerous places, still depending on intelligence analysts to give them accurate information, still trusting that the system will protect them from unnecessary risks. And they have people like you watching out for them now. People who understand what it means when intelligence goes wrong. People like us, I corrected. You've been part of this reform effort too. Your congressional testimony helped create the oversight mechanisms we have now. I had to learn some hard lessons before I could be useful, he said. But I'm grateful for the chance to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. We all had to learn hard lessons. That's what made the reforms possible. People who'd experienced the consequences of systemic failures were motivated to prevent them from happening again. The conversation reminded me of how much our relationship had evolved over the past decade. We'd moved from a dynamic of father and daughter, authority and subordinate, to something more like colleagues united by shared experience and common purpose. I'm proud of what you've built, he said before we hung up. Not just the professional achievements, but the way you've turned a personal trauma into institutional change. That takes a special kind of strength. I had good teachers, I replied, meaning, even when they were teaching lessons they didn't intend to teach. Later that night, I found myself reviewing the latest reports from intelligence verification units around the world. The concept we'd pioneered had spread to allied militaries, creating an international network of officers, trained to identify and prevent intelligence manipulation. The reports showed a steady decline in the kinds of contractor-related intelligence failures that had characterized the early not zero. There would always be some level of error, abuse in any large system, but significant improvement in the accuracy and reliability of intelligence products used for military planning. Each prevented incident represented lives saved, families kept intact, resources used effectively rather than wasted on unnecessary operations. It was the kind of success that was hard to measure precisely, but deeply meaningful to anyone who understood the costs of intelligence failure. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sergeant Martinez, my former subordinate, who now served as a senior enlisted advisor for special operations. Saw your presentation today online. Still teaching officers to ask the hard questions. I see. The Army's lucky to have you. I smiled and typed back. We're all lucky to have learned from each other. How's the new generation of soldiers looking? Smarter than we were at their age. More skeptical in a good way. They understand that courage sometimes means questioning orders rather than blindly following them. That's what we were hoping for. You did more than hope. You made it happen. The exchange reminded me that the impact of Operation Nightfall extended far beyond the specific reforms we'd implemented. It had become a touchstone for discussions about military ethics, civilian oversight of defense contractors, and the balance between loyalty and conscience in military service. Military academies now taught case studies based on the operation, using it to illustrate the complex ethical decisions that officers might face throughout their careers. Business schools examined the Meridian Solutions scandal as an example of how corporate cultures could drift toward illegal behavior when profit incentives weren't balanced by ethical constraints. Policy experts studied the intelligence reforms that followed as a model for how institutions could adapt and improve in response to systemic failures. The key insight was that effective reform required not just new rules and procedures, but cultural change that made critical thinking and ethical behavior as valued as traditional military virtues like courage and loyalty. The most important thing we accomplished, I'd told a gathering of defense policy experts the previous year, was changing the conversation about what it means to be a good soldier. We expanded the definition to include intellectual courage and ethical reasoning, not just physical bravery and technical competence. Standing at my window that night, looking out at the lights of the base, I thought about all the soldiers who would deploy tomorrow and in the weeks and months to come. They would face dangers I couldn't imagine, make decisions under pressure that would test their training and their character, trust in intelligence and support that they hoped would be accurate and reliable. The reforms we'd fought for wouldn't eliminate all risks or prevent all failure, but they had created a culture where questioning bad intelligence was seen as professional responsibility rather than disloyalty, where admitting uncertainty was valued over false confidence, where protecting soldiers from unnecessary harm was the highest priority. The metal fragments in my ribs pulsed with their familiar ache, but the sensation had become something different over the years. Instead of reminders of betrayal and institutional failure, they'd become symbols of accountability and systemic improvement. They reminded me daily that individuals could make a difference, that speaking truth to power was both possible and necessary, that institutions could be reformed from within by people willing to pay the personal cost of positive change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would always be people trying to manipulate intelligence for profit, always pressures that encouraged conformity over critical thinking, always temptations to take shortcuts that put soldiers at risk. But there would also always be people willing to stand up to those pressures, to ask hard questions, to prioritize principle over convenience. The work would continue because it had to continue. The price of complacency was too high, the stakes too important, the responsibility too sacred to abandon. Every intelligence analyst trained to think critically, every contractor held to ethical standards, every officer taught to balance loyalty with conscience, all of it mattered. All of it contributed to a system more worthy of the people who served within. As I prepared for bed, I thought about something Admiral Rodriguez had said during the final tribunal hearing 10 years earlier. Captain Chen's actions during Operation Nightfall demonstrate that courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it's charging an enemy position under fire. Sometimes it's standing up in a hearing room and telling a truth that powerful people don't want to hear. Both require the same fundamental willingness to put mission and people above personal safety. The scars on my ribs would always be there, permanent reminders of a night when everything went wrong and the long journey toward making it right. But they were also proof that survival was possible, that justice could prevail, and that institutional change was achievable when good people refused to accept unacceptable circumstances. The legacy of Operation Nightfall wasn't just the specific reforms it had generated, but the broader principle it had established, that individuals within large institutions have both the power and the responsibility to hold those institutions accountable to their highest value. It was a lesson written in scar tissue and sealed with the blood of soldiers who'd paid the price for institutional failure. And it was a lesson that would endure as long as there were people willing to carry it forward, to teach it to the next generation, to live it out in their daily choices, about whether to speak up or stay silent when they encountered corruption, incompetence, or moral compromise. The metal fragments in my ribs would always be there, but they'd become something more than reminders of trauma. They'd become symbols of hope, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal into something stronger, that even the worst betrayals could be transformed into lasting positive change, that even the most entrenched institutional problems could be solved by people with enough courage to confront them. That was the real victory of Operation Nightfall. Not just that justice was served or that specific abuses were corrected, but that a model was created for how individuals could drive institutional change through personal sacrifice and moral courage. It was a victory that would echo through every future decision to speak truth to power, every choice to prioritize principle over convenience, every moment when someone chose to be a good person first and let everything else follow from that foundation. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows of military service and the light of institutional reform. Sarah's story reminds us that courage isn't just about facing external enemies. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought within our own institutions, against our own people, for the sake of values that transcend personal ambition or organizational loyalty. As you go about your daily life, remember that you too have the power to hold institutions accountable, to speak truth to power, to choose principle over convenience. Whether you're in the military, in business, in government, or in any other organization, you can be the person who refuses to accept unacceptable circumstances and works to make things better. Where are you watching from today? Are you someone who has stood up to institutional pressure, or someone who is still finding the courage to speak up when you see something wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing it with others who might benefit from Sarah's example. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with words, principles, and the simple refusal to let corruption and incompetence harm innocent people. Remember, the scars we carry don't have to define us as victims. They can become symbols of survival, accountability, and positive change. Every institution is only as strong as the people within it, who are willing to hold it to its highest standards. Take care, stay strong, and never forget that your voice matters more than you might think. We'll see you in the next story.